The church I attended as a young person, beginning at age 9, was a church that peddled a fire and brimstone gospel fashioned from the image of a God who was always on the lookout for those doing wrong, a kind of cosmic police officer or security guard or border patrol agent. This God we were introduced to was a God who was constantly offended by human behavior and human mistakes, and because of the constant offense, made Jesus die for us in order to make us palatable in this God's eyes. Often the preacher would give the litany of sins we were to avoid at all costs. No swearing or drinking or having sex outside of marriage or even thinking about having sex or lusting after anyone in any way or causing others to lust, which of course was directed at those who identified as female. Women were to be submissive and men were to be strong leaders and upstanding citizens. As much as I search my memory about these sermons I barely listened to because of passing notes to the latest boy I liked at the time, I don't remember ever hearing a sermon about greed or about justice. There was no sense from this preacher that this God was a liberating God. Instead, this God was all about knowing when you did something you weren't supposed to and making sure judgment or punishment in some way would come. We were also told often that there were many people in the world who weren't yet saved, and we needed to tell them about Jesus so they too could be saved from the fires of hell. This is one kind of false God and gospel. A second kind of false God and gospel is what we today call the prosperity gospel. This one is no less harmful than the first one. This kind of church peddles a gospel about how if we do everything we are supposed to, and if we give lots of money to the church, this God will ensure that we are healthy and wealthy. This gospel is fashioned from the image of a God who rewards those who are righteous and punishes those who are wicked. This God cares about us, wants to shower us with health and wealth, and all it takes for that to happen is for us to toe the line. If we please this God, riches will follow. Unfortunately, this gospel also teaches that the opposite is true, that if someone is sick or becomes incapacitated in an accident or is diagnosed with ALS or loses a job or is never able to climb out of the poverty into which they were born, then it's entirely that person's fault, and they must have done something terribly wrong to be punished in that way. The hope is that if they can get right with this God, their fortune may change. This God and this gospel have become synonymous with consumerism and hypercapitalism and pure individualism. One's worth is measured by one's financial assets. Most of us are familiar with Joel Osteen and his version of this false gospel and God. There are also many traditionally black churches and pastors, like the Reverend Eddie Long in Atlanta, that peddle this gospel and God as a way to get church members to give huge amounts of money to the church in exchange for riches that will come their way so that they can buy the Mercedes or the Bentley or the Rolex, and the pastor is an example of that. For people who have come from a lineage of slaves, this particular God and gospel is appealing. A third version of false God and gospel is what Reverend Jennifer Butler calls the country club gospel. This gospel is about image, about climbing social ladders, about networking with people who can produce jobs and other opportunities. And rather than loving our neighbors, this gospel cares about being sure that our neighbors see us as important and worthy of admiration. This gospel is fashioned from the image of a God who is benign and who has very little interest in the world other than keeping a kind of order where people go to church and donate to missionary causes. This God is harmless And this gospel is more about attendance and giving money, but not too much money, than anything else. I imagine most of us in this room have at one time or another known or been a part of a country club church. While it satisfies the need to see and be seen, it does little more than that. A preacher of this false gospel says a whole lot of nothing and is careful not to upset anyone or say anything that would cause much in the way of deep examination or reflection. A person might learn a little bit at a country club church, but not about the kind of just society God wants us to be a part of building. The country club gospel is much more about making people feel good about themselves and their stations in life than it is about loving neighbor or transforming systems of oppression. In fact, many company presidents and CEOs belong to country club churches so they don't have to feel too badly about the kind of money they make on the backs of their employees. Reverend Jennifer Butler points out, after naming the various false gospels and gods, that these are not even the worst problem. Historically, Christianity has been used in horrific ways, from the Crusades to wars to justifying torture, justifying slavery and owning slaves, to apartheid, to genocide, and even to the Holocaust in Nazi Germany. Rather than Christianity being used in ways that were liberating and life-giving, it has been used across the centuries as a death-dealing force. Reverend Butler says this: God was melted down and recast in the image of the very genocidal tyrants the Yahweh of the Bible sought to cast down. This is the height of idolatry. People are still dying from the aftershocks. America is still fighting the war against slavery and the economic apartheid that followed, as Black, brown, and indigenous people are targeted with surgical precision by voter suppression laws, criminal justice systems bent on subjugation, deportation mechanisms, and white supremacist violence. Women are still struggling for equal representation, the right to live free from violence, and economic equality with men. Authoritarians design a punishing God. Those who worship wealth design an ATM God. Press the right buttons and you'll get everything you ever wanted. Pay to play. The Lord of the Manor holds fantastic parties for the blessed and comfortable. Those who want to rule as tyrants make God over to be a tyrant, a white supremacist, a strong man. God promised us the stars, but some who seek control rather than freedom constantly reduce God to an empty vessel of a bull. That's from her book on Who Stole My Bible. I don't know about you, but I have to admit it's been a while since I have seen an actual golden calf. The last time I saw one was when I was marching with a protest in downtown San Francisco against the big banks. A group had fashioned a huge papier-mâché golden calf, and it was carried all through the streets as we shouted in protest. During the Occupy Wall Street movement, there were many golden calves that also occupied those spaces. Golden calves have represented a visual form of greed that is blatant and harms the masses. Isn't it interesting to hear the story again of how Aaron and the people fashioned the first golden calf out of gold? How many of you have heard the story before of the golden calf being fashioned? So a bunch of you. Did you remember some of the details when Rob was reading it again? I had forgotten some things about it. What struck me in reading the story again a few times is the fear that led to the golden calf, this false god, this stand-in God. Moses was taking a little bit too long up on the mountain, and the people were not only growing restless, but were afraid that something had happened to Moses. "We don't have a clue what happened to him," they said, "so let's make our own gods to lead us." Beyond not knowing what happened to Moses, this was a time of huge fear for the people who were strangers in a land they did not know and who had not yet learned how to be free. So their response was to fall back on the familiar, which was to make a god and offer sacrifices to it. So that's what they did. Aaron, the one in charge while Moses was away, gave the people what they wanted and fashioned this god of gold in the form of a bull calf. They got up the next day and had a big festival so everyone could sacrifice and celebrate. On the surface, in my reading of it, it seems like God and then Moses might have overreacted a bit because the punishment that follows ends up being death for many of the people. Last week we talked about how the first commandment was to have no other gods before this God. So obviously we know that commandment is important. But punishable by death? When we consider this whole story, we have to remember that part of what God wanted was relationship with the people in a way that was different from the relationship they had with the many gods they worshiped at the time. If you kill the people, there is no relationship. So what else is going on? Part of the language used in Exodus 32 is that the people were out of control and that Aaron had allowed them to be out of control. Is the being out of control what was so egregious? I don't understand how you can take an entire people who had only ever known slavery in Egypt for all of their lives and then free them only to have them living in a wilderness they didn't know, surrounded by dangerous tribes they didn't know, on their way to a new land which they didn't know, and then expect them to be unafraid and completely in control. Part of me wonders if perhaps both God and Moses also succumbed to fear in this trying moment. Did they fear the people would always be out of control? Was God suddenly aware that they might always fall back on their familiar gods? Did Moses wonder if God would hold him personally responsible? Is it possible that fear entered into their response to the people, making what could be called a huge mistake? It's easy to see how these Hebrew scriptures lead to some of the hellfire and brimstone false gods and gospels we hear and know. But landing there is a mistake. At the heart of the first 5 books of the Hebrew scriptures is this God, Yahweh or Elohim or I am who I am, who constantly reminds the people that God brought them up out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. There are 6 times more references to God bringing them up out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery, than there are to references to God as creator or the one who created the universe. Let that sink in for a minute. 6 times as many references in these 5 books. Reverend Jennifer Butler points out how often we pray to Creator God, but rarely pray to Liberating God, and wonders why that is true. Part of why tyranny is growing is that people in power, or who want to be in power, fashion the God who appears as a tyrant, but then masks this God in liberation. Making America great again could well be the slogan of the people who ask Aaron to fashion a God who can lead them. Making America great again is all about fashioning the golden calf, but in the form of a human, and bowing to it and worshiping riches and those who have them. Making America great again is all about going back to Egypt, to the comfort of what we have known, which in the United States goes back to slavery and Jim Crow and the reign of white and Christian supremacy. Anyone who thinks otherwise needs to listen to what is being said. But let's look at what else is going on today that touches on this story of fear. We know from history how difficult it is to live in slavery anywhere and then be freed and liberated and expected to immediately know how to live as a free or liberated person. We hear from returning citizens that upon being released from prison and being free, so to speak, it is very difficult to suddenly live alone, with no particular schedule, with no idea how to earn money, and massive obstacles put in your way to getting a decent job, and people everywhere trying to get you to follow them into a different version of being a slave to something or being imprisoned by something. We know from the stories of queer youth who run away from their abusive families that freedom often consists of sex trafficking or being forced into the sex trade, chronic homelessness, substance abuse to numb the pain, and often physical and sexual assault. They are escaping one form of religious slavery that leads to another kind of slavery. Youth who are able to find a way out have to be taught and worked with on how to live outside of slavery. Bishop Yvette Flunder and the Ark of Refuge in Oakland, California, have a home for these youth where they come to live, where they come to learn to live into freedom and what freedom can look like. We have two kinds of wildernesses happening in the United States and here in Chicago that I want to address in terms of fear. We have Black and brown and indigenous people who have long suffered at the hands of white and Christian supremacy, whose lands have been stolen, whose children have been stolen and killed, who continue to struggle with a racial wealth gap that is not closing for most. We have neighborhoods all across Chicago that are current examples of segregation, disinvestment, and systemic racism. We have families and generations that have been devastated by mass incarceration and the targeting of Black and brown people to fill prison systems that make money for private companies. At the same time, we have immigrants coming to this country to flee hardship, violence, and poverty in their own countries. What we often forget is that in many of their countries, our government has played or is playing a role in creating these hardships. We wonder why so many Venezuelans are crossing the border and then being sent to cities like ours. We forget that under former President Trump, oil sanctions hit Venezuela hard, and when the assets of their major oil companies were frozen, it was everyday people who were most impacted. The economic catastrophe and the brutal repression under the current tyrant, Maduro, has led to more than 7 million people fleeing the country. That's just Venezuela. While the stories are different in each country, forcing people to flee, there is no question that there are good reasons. I hear the stories from our own asylum seekers, as well as those who are now working with our Faith Community Initiative. Similar to the Great Migration that happened here in this country, when Black people were escaping from the Jim Crow South, we can assume that most people would never choose to leave the place they call home without good reason. Leaving is often dangerous, and no one would undertake the danger unless forced by some circumstance. Right now in Chicago, these two wildernesses are converging and fear is rampant. At the public hearing for the Committee on Immigrant and Refugee Rights a week ago, I spoke during public comment as the hearing began. I ended my statement by saying one of the sharpest tools in the toolbox of white supremacy is to pit Black and brown people against each other so that they are so busy fighting each other, they can't fight against the oppressor of both of them. And then I said to those gathered, let's not give in to white supremacy in this hearing, and instead, let's focus on the oppression itself. The exact opposite is what happened. Black and brown people were definitely pitted against each other. The fear for Black people is that if money is spent on caring for migrants' basic needs, the people and neighborhoods here who have long been neglected will continue to be neglected while these brand new people get help. The fear for immigrants and those who work for immigrants' rights is that those who came here seeking a better life will surely die if they face a Chicago winter outside, and many of them will be imprisoned or killed if they are deported back to their countries. The fear on the part of both of these groups is real. The fear the people felt in the wilderness at Sinai was real. There is incredible vulnerability in all of it. There are not easy or simple answers to any of it. Who can be trusted at a time like this? Who shouldn't be trusted? In Exodus, the people were new to a relationship with one God, Yahweh. They weren't experienced in trust or faith or listening. In Chicago, Black people have never had reason to trust the systems around them because the systems have never been geared toward their thriving. Immigrants fleeing to this country can't trust anyone because their own governments have failed them. The U.S. says one thing and does another. And even other immigrants who have been here a while look on them in some cases with disdain. I've heard story after story of immigrants who have been here a while taking advantage of new arrivals. It sickens me. As a white person who understands how white supremacy and systemic racism has operated and continues to operate in this country, I can state some truths. The idea of scarcity, that there is not enough for everyone, is false. It is a false gospel. People go hungry in this country every day, and we have more than enough food to feed everyone and then some. The wealth in this country is hard to even fathom. Scarcity is a false gospel peddled by those who insist on maintaining white supremacy and systemic racism. Scarcity is what stokes the fear of one group against another. While there doesn't appear to be enough housing or money in Chicago to care for the 17,000 new arrivals or to invest in our long neglected neighborhoods and people, that is not the truth. We do have enough. It's all about how it gets distributed, who owns it, who controls the story about it, and who has the decision-making power and has had all these years. that is the problem. The other truth that needs to be stated is that when our fear leads to dehumanizing another person or group, we are following a false god or gospel. Anytime we say that we don't have to care for and in fact can demonize a whole group of people, we have fashioned the god of self that proclaims superiority over another. These have been the hard lessons of white and Christian supremacy and systemic racism. How will we, together, in community, meet this particular wilderness? We are white and black and brown and Asian and Pacific Islander, and we believe in God who calls us to relationship and care and community and loving our neighbors. What is our fear? How will we identify our fear and choose to respond to it? Will we look to a temporary leader to dispel our fear? Will we seek after some kind of false gospel? God of Abraham and Sarah and Miriam and Moses and Jesus and Priscilla, this very same God calls us to fear not. It doesn't mean that we have to pretend we don't have fear. It simply means we are called to not act in fear. We have a voice in the midst of this Chicago wilderness. May we have the courage to speak against false gods and gospels, and to speak on behalf of the God who liberates and calls us to liberation for all. Amen.